big lessons from that we've seen through the course. One is look at it in context. Don't just describe and say the budget increased by 10% today or this year, and who said that and that we've read and talked about, and what theory was that called. I added a little bit to that, but that is, normal journalism, normal descriptive sociology, whatever, says the budget increased. So what? And there are lots of people who just say we just report the facts and tell the story. Incrementalism said the budget increased X percent, which was an X percent change from last year, because budgets are incremental, and that was a big theory in off and on in a number of contexts. Aaron Vildovsky embraced this theory. Pat Persine at Carnegie Mellon and others at Michigan continued it for a number of years. Vildovsky rejected and threw it out, or put it in context by saying, in certain time periods we have something more like this, but in other time periods we don't. This is also a way of conceptualizing where and how culture works. That culture may enter more explicitly when we have turbulence, times of change, and we become more conscious of the bigger assumptions under which people are working or thinking, or their broader views, which get challenged when 1968 came along, when the Berlin Wall went down. Then big things begin to be asked, and then people are making more fundamental changes. In Eastern Europe after 68, I worked with a number of people in Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, and at that point, almost everything from in terms of local decisions were up for grabs. What should be private? What should be public? What should be done by private banks? What should be done by the government? What should the bus system be a city government owned and maintained kind of policy, or should it be sold out to the private sector? And if so, what regulations should be maintained? In the U.S., hot debates over schooling. Should we have vouchers that the government might give to low-income students so that they could choose their school, which might be private or public? Only Milwaukee, as a large city, did that, but there have been a lot of evaluations of how that worked. And the people normally opposing it say, don't do that, that will simply help the rich, and the poor people will be in poorer schools. And so Milwaukee was clearly aware of that argument, so they structured it in a way that they had quotas, they had transfer questionnaires. I mean, there are lots of things were done in ways that refuted the normal arguments of left and right, pro and con. Okay, so look at context is the big simple lesson. And the way we frame this is to use what you've seen here many times now, a background of the big dynamics of citizen or community characteristics, which lead into the political leaders like the mayor and the council member, to organized groups and citizen groups, etc. And then how each of these may interpenetrate and lead to feedback. So if people see something isn't working, do they change it or not? Do they just complain, or do they say, we need to throw out the mayor? And so in this way, environmental regulation, sustainability came in as major policies across the U.S. When mayors refused, city council members said, oh no, we need economic growth. We don't want to have more sustainability. That will hurt the growth of jobs. Okay, that argument got rejected in many places, from Boca Raton, Florida, to Palo Alto, to Seattle, to San Francisco, and you had a whole set of new leaders which have increased and increased over decades, Obama particularly stressed things like many sustainability policies at a national level, but these still varied in how they were implemented locally, and you get lots of variations in these kinds of respects. But that's simply an illustration of how even a bad policy can lead to rethinking what led to it, and therefore changing the policy to make it more acceptable to people in one area or one neighborhood. So citizen preferences. Then, if we think of the big theories about what are the drivers, the big drivers of policy here. The classic one historically is clientelism, which is still a major, if not the major, policy decision-making process in the entire world. The padrone gave me a job. I give him my vote. The output is the vote and the job, and it doesn't matter to the citizen who said that. That is, the clientelism classically in Ireland and Italy, where it's been most studied, or in neighborhoods of Chicago, which follow that, talk about the non-ideological particularism. That's a term that I've used for the Irish in Chicago. Non-ideological in the sense that there's no link of the citizens' clientelist support for the leader. The padrone does, what he wants to do with my vote, I don't care. Okay, that has changed around the world as citizens have gotten more educated. They want to know what's happening to my vote. How are policies affecting me and the people who think like me, in whether this is in Hong Kong right now, of students who were more hierarchically responsive in the past, or union members who say, we're going to reject what the union leaders have negotiated. We don't trust the union leadership. That's happening within teachers' unions, especially, for instance, where many teachers are very concerned about students and their professional improvement of doing a good job. They don't just want to be promoted with higher salary for their whole career, with nothing else considered. The traditional unions, including the teachers' unions, have done that. And now in the last strike in Chicago, we have seen an incorporation of some of these bigger concerns, talking about the neighborhood, talking about having social workers in a school. Those are new kinds of expanding of demands, and the city has tended to improve these. But even as of a week ago, it wasn't clear if the teachers individually would accept this kind of settlement. So again, clientelism thus is the political leader gives a good, normally a separable, not a public good, a separable private good to a precinct captain, who in turn gives an individual benefit to a citizen, such as fixing a parking ticket or getting a son a job, and the citizen in turn gives his vote to the political leader. That's the classic triangle of clientelism, or non-ideological clientelism. Okay. In China, with Mao, you had a change. That is, clearly there was lots of clientelism, but they added forcefully, having marched with Mao on the Long March fighting against Chiang Kai-shek, one, and two, Communist Party ideological support and commitment. So in that sense, many of the top political leaders for a couple of generations in China had a combination of clientelism, but it was not non-ideological the way it had been and has been more recently in Italy, Italy and Ireland, for instance, as most documented there. So ideology can enter. So that's model one. Model two is class, basically, which led to the normal left-right mean, in secular manner, this was Marxism. It was the labor versus the management. It ended up in more party politics. So the party left-right of higher spending, lower spending, like the Democrats, Republicans, the socialist communists versus the conservatives in Europe, basically imply that if we have people who are of this party, of this ideological orientation, we will have more spending, bigger government, more controls, more regulation, versus markets, smaller, lesser, or not necessarily markets. That you can have people who want something else. So markets are an increasingly visible alternative, but they are not the only answer. The third, then, in a sense, if we want to go just continue this briefly in terms of whether the big blocks of variables about leading to policy outputs are more combinations, transformations of these classic backgrounds. In a sense, Mao illustrated that by combining the Communist Party support with clientelism. Another big combination is illustrated by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, where they combine fiscal conservatism with social liberalism. They were on the left on their social program, helping women, helping minorities. They were on the right on their fiscal program of being conservative in terms of taxes, holding down taxes. How then does that change the kind of policy output which they pursued in contrast to a traditional left and right? The traditional left wanted more spending. Traditional right wanted less. If you try to combine these in the way, and we've talked about this, of course, is the new political culture. How does the new political culture generate distinctive policies? What does their fundamental ideological commitment drive them toward, which is different from what we've seen with the left and right with clientelism? Who wants to answer that? It's in the readings, but I didn't talk about it very much here. But if you read or most of all, if you think about it, if you're Bill Clinton, you say, I want low taxes, because citizens really want lower taxes. But I want to show I support equal, I'm not discriminatory, I'm in favor of tolerance. If they're talented women and African Americans, they should be promoted in government jobs and so forth. How can you show that that's a strong commitment, and how does it make things fundamentally different from the past? Okay, the simple answer is productivity. Don't just do, that is, the classic right would basically say, fire people. If you've got less money, fire the workers. Fewer jobs. Traditional left, hire more people, more jobs, more taxes, increase revenues. The combination says neither of those. For the new, they say instead, hold down the taxes, but provide good and better services. They're not against good services and more services. Most of these people are from the left. They want more good services, but they don't want them to be simply money. They want them to be actual things that work and work well. Okay, so this leads to things like smart. Try to be more smart about how you do things. Exploring multiple alternatives of how services are delivered. And so in Chicago started from a more clientelist background, but with Harold Washington and then Daley too, and Rahm Emanuel, you got a lot of techie people from outside, promotions of people who had really better mousetraps. And this went back to Daley 1. I mean, Daley 1 was always very concerned with how government worked. In Chicago, in that sense, was not contrasted with the old Pittsburgh machine or the old Newark machines. They just gave contracts to their supporters, and they had bad services. That basically, Chicago with Daily One wanted good services. He was vicious. He would fire a top person in his government if there was a scandal or something really worked poorly. If there was a flood, if you had a big traffic accident, you had fires, and someone was to blame, and something had to change so it would never happen in the future. I mean, Daley in that sense was explicit that we will deliver high quality services and we'll learn from our mistakes. And his top staff were very, very, very conscious of being the best in the country, best in the world that they could find, trying to provide this. So this went on through Harold Washington with into the at least the public orientation in that direction of Rahm Emanuel. So the press, the short-term scandals don't always play this up. They may bring in other things, but this was clearly the focus when you look in more detail at the kinds of things that people get hired or promoted on. Lots more universalism in that sense. Even in Chicago, with its strong and still partially enduring legacy of clientelism. Whereas in Scandinavia, I work with lots of Scandinavian political scientists. We talk about clientelism and the Scandinavians. More than half of them will say, "What's that?" You describe it. That's illegal. You can't do that. There are huge cultural differences. You talk to the Italians and they say, that's life. Everybody's that way. Okay. Okay, big points. Look at the policy outputs in context. In that sense, we've also been doing this through the whole course. And so from beginning to end, you've been getting some kind of theory, evidence, examples, which link with policy outputs because they link with the section on political leadership right at the beginning, on organized groups, on voting, on new citizen characteristics, on migration, etc. So you've seen lots of things covered in these respects. Let me come into one or two points, and then we'll have some discussion. So let me give you a little background moving toward the session on Wednesday with Switzerland. Why is Switzerland important? It's a very important example. It's not just a little country that's isolated and irrelevant to the world. It has, like the New England, of which it is culturally a part, it has lessons for the world which the rest of the world is now actively looking for. I mean, in a sense, the student protesters in Hong Kong are looking for more responsiveness to citizens from bottom up. They're basically attacking hierarchy. So the individual events and all of that are small and whatever. The big thing is we want to be treated more equally, and we don't want people just to tell us what to do, to boss us around. Okay, that is not just China. The same thing happened in 1968 in Paris, in New York, in Columbia, in Berkeley, etc. And this kind of movement is going on within corporations. Corporations are becoming more like Microsoft. They're delegating more responsibility to lower and lower levels. And Microsoft did it first. You can read this in business magazines, but the majority of U.S. corporations, at least now, have been saying for 20 plus years that they're doing this as much as they can. So we've had a cultural transformation in many, many institutions. And in that respect, the media, travel, organized groups like Amnesty International or women's movements play up these kinds of things. Oh, you mean women can do that in Saudi Arabia? Oh, yeah. So in Saudi Arabia, they're now, in the last week, we hear, they're dramatically increasing the rights of women to be able to drive alone, to do things which they could not do previously. At the same time, there's still a very tight crackdown on politics, on people who might be criticizing the political elite. That's more the Chinese model. That is the Chinese, that is in contrast, after the Berlin Wall went down, the Russians basically said, okay, we're abandoning communism, we're abandoning socialist state planning, we're embracing markets, we want to do what they're doing in the West, and we want our political system as well as our economic system to be totally transformed. We want elections, we want freedom, we want, and so forth. And so many people in Russia and Eastern Europe, as it most visibly say in Hungary, about 2 or 3 years after this happened in Hungary, the Hungarians voted in, it was not a majority, but it was a plurality. That is, what party got the most votes in Hungary 2, 3, 4 years after 1989? Anybody know? The Communist Party. The Communist Party was legitimately, openly, directly re-elected by the citizens because they wanted those things that they were used to. They wanted more egalitarianism. They didn't like all this competition among private firms. So in that and then what do we have in Russia? Putin. So Putin, in a sense, is an authoritarian reaction against what many of the citizens and local organized groups said. We went too far and too fast. So in a sense, you could say Saudi Arabia is now following that model, in which the Chinese followed throughout. The Chinese never, I won't say never, the Chinese have basically gradually opened up the political system. They have more participation, more openness, they have more active organized groups. That is Hong Kong, the big point is Hong Kong is not Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square, students were protesting, tanks went right in, people were shot, they were carried off, taken to jail immediately. There was no discussion, it was just an instinctive reaction like that. The hierarchy, you don't follow the hierarchy, you're killed or you go to jail. Bang! Same thing in Mexico. Traditionally, there were indigenous Mexican native ethnic groups who had protested against the national government. The Mexican army would go in and shoot people. They just machine gun the political leaders, just like that. That changed when Mrs. Mitterrand and some sociologists and some press people flew to Mexico City. They got together with some progressive media people from Mexico, and they went by bus down to the Chiapas area, and they then published. They put all this on the on the videos. The media covered it worldwide, and the army, the Mexican army, did not shoot the local people. Since then, Chiapas, the minority politics has become a major part of Mexican politics in ways that we have with African Americans in the U.S. Maybe not quite as much, but it is that this illustrates the degree to which you can have variations in these kinds of treatments. So treatments in the sense that we have different, more complicated combinations. So the Russia versus China, or let's say Trump versus Ford. The Ford brothers in Toronto and Ontario are like Trump in being they have an anti-artist, anti-bicycle, anti-gay style, but they're pro-immigrant, and their political base is with the recent immigrants to Toronto. People who have come from other places and who want a more authoritarian family values. They're in that sense like the Saudi Arabians are doing. Okay? So, or the Russians are doing, and what the Chinese have been doing. That is, the older left and right of the New Deal is not universal. We have okay, so then another way that we've illustrated this is we can go further, so that people talk about social and fiscal issues as did we in discussing the new political culture. Then when we went on to scenes and we get to these multiple individual characteristics like transgressionism, glamour, um, cosmopolitan urbanity versus localism, ethnic solidarity, and the more, let's call this local urbane. And we then run this against presidential voting, presidential party voting, presidential party votes, percent of votes for the Republicans versus the Democrats. This would be percent Democratic presidential voting. Basically, around 1980 or so, 80s and 90s, these were zero. These have become 300% larger over that is, these are Scenes dimensions. And the point is not to talk about the left or the right or socially liberal. Those are too simple, because you can be in favor of the environment, but you can be against women's rights, or vice versa. You can be gay and against animal rights, or you can be gay and in favor of transgression or not. So the Boys Town, that is, gaydoms, the gay hoods, gay neighborhoods have been in decline for 10 years or so in the U.S. Why? There's a new literature on this. Because gays no longer need to live adjacent to one another in order to connect. They have pop-up parties, other things. Similarly, when Daley et al., Daley too, were celebrating the rise of the arts in Chicago, they were putting up statues, they were putting up various kinds of celebration of different neighborhoods, Greek statues in Greek Town, Chinese art in Chinatown. When they got to Boys Town, they said, we're going to put up some rainbow sculptures that look maybe sort of like a male sexual organ with colors on it. We're going to put these in on Halsted Street at the beginning, at the north and the south and the middle ends of this gay neighborhood. And they had said, okay, we're public hearings. Shall we do this? A lot of people came out and said, no, don't do this. I don't want my grandmother to know I'm living with men. She thinks I'm a good middle-class American, that I go to church when I'm at home with her, and in our small town in Arkansas, et cetera, et cetera. So the city government ignored the citizens and said, an ethnic group is an ethnic group, and gays are an ethnic group like all the rest, and they in turn acted in those terms. They had big, sort of, if you will, rather openly transgressive, shirts off, nude, floats, demonstrations. It's still one of the great parades in Chicago, gay parade up that area. But these are much less visible. They're not the emotional. Gays can come out. That is, gays have been out for a long time now, or at least almost a generation. So you don't have to have living in a separate neighborhood an identity marker the way it was 10 or 20 years ago. As a consequence, but for some people, you still do. That is, some people feel, I want to be with other gays, and I want to live that way explicitly. I want to have hair. I want to have walking, linguistic style restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. So, but what neighborhood is now has the most large number of lesbians and gays? It's north of there. It looks like the northern suburbs of Chicago. It looks like classic middle class, business American, proper ladies in business suits, etc. Older people who are retired who look conservative. Okay, so you have and so you have different lifestyles. There's a book and a paper in the AGS, lead paper in the AGS by I think her name a very smart woman who studied sort of lesbian activity. She has case studies of 4 lesbians in 4 cities across the country, from Portland, Maine to California. In Portland, Maine, they're one style. In Ithaca, New York, They're business women, so lesbians are business women. There's nothing visible about how they live different lifestyles. In California, they're girls on the beach who rub each other's legs and who are openly engaging in somewhat transgressive activities as part of the local culture. So you have in 4 cities, 4 different, very different lifestyles. So the big point is, there is no simple gay or lesbian lifestyle. There are many different ways to be all of these, and that's what we see here. That these things, we have differences in culture more generally. And I'm using gays because it's one of the 4 or 5 big social movements which have been identified and stressed and interpreted as a new social movement. But the point is, being high on one social movement dimension, like sustainability, doesn't explain your position on gaydom or social tolerance or fiscal issues. So you may be fiscally conservative, or you may want to have a big, very active government, etc. These things are all over the place, and life is more complicated. Does the media tell you this? No. They simply, you try, the media and many social scientists, certainly many of the candidates for office are saying, I'm a better Republican than he is, and so forth. And the number of issues tends to be simplified. On the other hand, Trump, you could say, what the media and the press will say, Trump is contradicting himself. Look at his Twitter tweets. Look at 1 week. In 1 week, he can say 5 different things that are totally contradictory. Contradictory in terms of the classic left-right position, which you still often get in interpretations like, say, the New York Times. New York Times writers, New York Times for 20 years would basically deny that people like Dianne Feinstein were different than Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, the classic New Deal Democratic leader. Dianne Feinstein was the beginning of this new political culture, as was Kathy Whitmire in Houston. Women, and Kathy Whitmire mobilized gays and lesbians to elect her, and they beat the old cowboys in Houston, middle of Texas. They won. Okay, so that was a small revolution. Edward Koch in New York, same kind of thing. So you had local leaders doing this before Bill Clinton did this more openly as president, and even Bill Clinton now is partially forgotten for some of this, in the sense that Hillary Clinton has moved closer to Obama. That is, Hillary Clinton is closer to the traditional left and right than Bill Clinton was at the beginning, and Bill Clinton in turn was closer to the mayors, and the mayors were reflecting more citizens. Okay, Switzerland. Okay, what are some policy options that Chicago might consider, given that the city, the state of Illinois, the city and the state are basically bankrupt. I mean, if they had to pay all the obligations which are due to the people who are retired or declare bankruptcy, they declare bankruptcy. They don't have the money. So what does Chicago do? What did Illinois do? One thing which has been, and so let me throw out one or two things. We can think about them and then explore them more if we have other people here and if we have our Swiss expert. Erwin Zimmerman, he's a terrific, humorous, engaging, very knowledgeable guy, and he taught me all kinds of things about Switzerland when he was a grad student here. One of the biggest is organized groups. And so the big actor in Chicago, which is a full book just on the teachers' union, was by Bill Grimshaw, my collaborator on the Oral History of Chicago, and then Paul Peterson, who we taught the workshop on it, and we read his book on city limits. He has another book. Both of them wrote books basically saying Chicago is governed by the teachers' union. A little bit overstatement, but at least in the issue area of schools, and the number one biggest budget by far is not was not the city of Chicago, was not the Park District, was not pollution sanitary districts, it was schools. So schools are the biggest parts of local budgets everywhere in the U.S. In the world, they are not, because schools are not local in 99%. So that's 99%, maybe a slight exaggeration. I don't have numbers on this. But basically, schools in most of the world are national. You have a Ministry of Education, so you have national standards that all students have to fulfill. Whereas in the U.S. we have Tocquevillian democracy, and we have little local school boards, and these make big decisions. So when we asked a student in this class, I said, what's distinctive about the South? What did he immediately talk about? What were his examples? Anybody remember? First he said, yes, sir. And then he went on. What did he say?
He said they didn't teach evolution.
They don't teach evolution in his school in Georgia. That's pretty, I mean, this was documented 50, 75 years ago as a classic reaction, but to hear that today by a UC student, this is, that evolution is still left out of the public, the curriculum in his, that is, it has a local school board which says you can or you cannot teach evolution in the biology classes of this high school. Okay, that doesn't happen in Sweden, in France, in Japan, because the Ministry of Education says, oh, of course we teach evolution. They don't give this kind of, okay, another example. James Coleman, talented genius here, studied fluoridation of water. Which cities in the U.S., when fluoride was discovered as helping improve your teeth, reducing the number of cavities in your teeth, and so they started putting it in toothpaste and selling it. And then, after they had it in toothpaste, it's now in all the toothpaste, basically. But public organizations, city governments, most of all, started adding fluoride to the water across the whole U.S. But these decisions were made not by the national government, they were made by local governments, usually cities, counties, districts, etc. And so Jim Coleman studied these and try to see where and why is fluoride, that's many of them, some of them embraced this new scientific finding, this will make our kids' teeth better and for life. And others said, no! And so you had people who said, this is, there were all kinds of interesting anti-intellectual reverberations of conflicts of saying, against it, this is a conspiracy of the Colgate company, it's a conspiracy of the drug companies to try to poison us, etc. It was big stuff in the 50s, 60s, whatever. So Coleman tried to study where and why do we have this. And his basic finding was, if you have a referendum and if you have active discussion by lots of groups and you bring in outside speakers and discussants and so forth, fluoridation tends to get rejected. Whereas if you have just a hierarchical political leader and a public health officer who says, yes, let's fluoridate the water. Okay, this was one of the classic examples which we tried to deal with when we're dealing with this question of A. I mean, what leads to higher policy outcomes? So Coleman showed you don't get water fluoridation if you have more decentralization. And whereas another classic example, E.O. Key's book on the South looked at welfare benefits. Welfare benefits were higher in the North than they were in the South in general, and they were higher if you go state by state. They were particularly high if you had more active Democratic Party kinds of folks. Whereas in the South, you tended to have fewer welfare benefits for poor people for decades. these look like contradictory findings. Vioki versus Coleman. But that came from the fact that the way I framed this was the way that the literature, social scientists, and others talk about high and low, whereas the resolution of the way of resolving that conflict analytically. Anybody see the message I'm getting to? Maybe it's a little bit subtle, but it's the same kind of message that we get to here. That is, don't just talk about policy outputs, which is too abstract and loose, or more expensive, less expensive. Look more at the specific content. And when we look at the content of the policy, such as fluoridation or welfare benefits, and then try to say what's the meaning of this policy and what's the context within which the decision is made, we then get to the thing we've had on the board. Centralization encourages public goods, and centralization discourages private goods. So private goods in that sense is welfare. Public goods is fluoridation of the water. And then the two contradictory findings from Vioki and Coleman fit, or that is, they're consistent with a more general proposition which holds them together, which is what we're trying to do with building analyses and models of where and how these work with derivable propositions of a more abstract sort, and then getting down to specifics in cases. Okay, so let me then put in one or 2 points on Switzerland. Then let's have a little more general discussion. Switzerland is one of the most admired countries in the world. If you ask citizens, are you happy to be Swiss? I mean, do you want to move? Do you want to migrate, etc.? They're satisfied. They trust their political leaders. You know, lots of trust in political leaders. Like many of the Scandinavians. I mean, 80-90% Scandinavians and Swiss, political leaders are sure. Of course, we trust them. We elected them. You go to Latin America. 15% of the citizens say they trust their political leaders. 90% of Latin Americans say don't trust those guys. They're taking bribes. We don't. So that is the governor of Mexico, the Mexico City area said no male police officers can give out speeding tickets, assuming every male policeman, most of them, were just taking bribes. And that's the degree to which you had a sense of distrust. In policy, in a specific policy, in forming a policy, male police officers can't give tickets. Switzerland is the converse. It's high on trust. It's high on it. That is, Switzerland illustrates productivity. They've been doing it for a long time. What are the images we have? The stereotypical things. Swiss watches. They work. They're precise. They're complicated. They're put together. Engineering. They're really good engineers. I mean, they're like the Germans, but they're not authoritarian. Okay. The exception, in a sense, I mean, Switzerland, nevertheless, internally has three big regions: French, German, and Italian. And there are big differences among them. So the furthest from that, and so the ideal Swiss example here, which they have in there's a national museum that is the most visited. There's a museum in Switzerland, and they have data on who goes to which museum. The most popular museum in the whole of Switzerland was a museum of the Swiss nation, and it's a little ideal town of a handful of people, and it's high on a mountain, and it's like the American cowboy town, the village in the West, where you have the cowboy, the sheriff, and the bad guy. And so if that's one American town, the Swiss town is democratic, egalitarian, trusting, and again, the partial exception is Geneva. So Geneva is big. It's closer to France, and it has more of a sense of of a macho, charismatic style that you get with the French political leaders, who were continually criticized by others as being arrogant, etc., etc. The ideal, that is, many of the leaders, they do have political parties. They have a left and a right, but they tend not to have what you have, especially with Trump. That is the personalization. Me, or make a deal which I can do better than the left. Obama made a bad deal with Iran. I can negotiate a better deal. Vote for me. That style is the opposite of the Swiss. The Swiss have a very impersonal style of talking about the executive or the political leadership. They don't name names. They don't claim responsibility. They try to build. So we talked about how do you measure and how do you capture or illustrate the sort of New England and what the New England township meeting, and I said it's like a Quaker meeting. You have people sit around and they talk and they try to find a compromise. They don't just call a vote and say, we had 50% in one vote, so we won. You're 49%, you lost. They don't do that. They say, let's talk through this until we get a large majority, lots of support. We'll change the policy, we'll change the content of the policy to fit with what everyone wants to have done as best we can. How about, and who's likely to disturb this process? Most of all, the organized groups. So if you have unions, a neighborhood group that says, we don't want, Italians living in our neighborhood. Another group will say, we're in favor of sustainability. We don't care about Italian immigrants, but we do care about more support for bicycles. So you can have, in Switzerland, as in everywhere in the world, they have organized groups. The big difference in Switzerland, or one big difference, is when they have city council hearings, they don't just invite one organized group to come in and say, yes, the Chicago Teachers Union wants this, and if you don't give it to us, we're going to shut down the schools, and all the parents are going to have to do daycare themselves. It's going to be hard on you. You're going to suffer if we strike. Okay, that's the American style, and that's the French, the German. This is the general style of making these decisions. The Swiss instead say, let's have a hearing. Let's bring the teachers union, the parent teachers association, the taxpayers association, the business association, the neighborhood associations, all together. And let's have a hearing and say, how much should we pay the teachers? And everybody talks together. So it's not as if it's just the mayor. It's not Laurie Lightfoot alone who said, my solution is we're going to do this. The ideal is a collective, collegial decision, and it may take a long time. And then if they can't reach a pretty strong, substantial majority, what do they do? Anybody look at anything that I sent out for the background? Or even if you just saw the email that was listed in the summary of what Erin will talk about on Wednesday. Something that we do more in Ohio and California than in the rest of the U.S. What's that? They disagree with the organized groups and the mayors and the council members. They hold a referendum to the citizens. So the citizens decide. And they hold lots of referenda on lots of issues at the neighborhood, the city council, and what's called the commune. They're basically the commune level. What we talk about nations from the 19th century. There is no nation of Switzerland. There's a confederation. It's called a confederation, just as the U.S. legally uses the term the federal government. And so the terminology of decentralization, of bottom-up, of the citizen is the legitimate base of all government policy. It's the opposite of the top-down, charismatic leader who will solve all of our problems. Okay, so part of the way that they have basically improved productivity is to try to bring together the multiple participants and not say, you are all here, and this works more easily when you have more trust and where you have people who know each other pretty well and the town is smaller. When you get to Geneva, it's more like Paris or New York or Chicago. And you tend to speak people, the organized groups can be more self-interested. Some of the mayors can be more individualistic. But Geneva has, in the area, has had more fiscal problems than the other Swiss cities. So, in that sense, Geneva is an exception to the north of the Swiss small town, which fits this kind of characterization better. But the idea of having hearings where you could bring in not just the union, but the parents, neighborhood associations, other civic groups, other organized groups, and let's say the private schools, the charter schools, people who've been studying how, say, people from other cities. That is, this could happen even in Chicago. And it's a fairly specific short-term policy, a way of delivering and of mobilizing specifics around one policy that is a relatively small. I mean, the bigger background, of course, is, as you know from Max Weber and the Protestantism, is called Calvinism. That is, Calvinism is the intellectual link. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Rousseau and Calvin were these Frenchmen who had strong egalitarian theories, and the French would have guillotined them if it stayed in France. So they went to Switzerland, and the Swiss said yes, and these are the heroes of Switzerland today, of decentralization, citizens' engagement, and moral engagement in the political process. They're saying this is treat the town, treat the teachers, treat the schools like your own family, and ask what's right or wrong in ways that you would ask of your children. Don't see this as a corrupt, distant kind of entity or institution. So moralistic politics comes from Calvinism and is now spreading into Hong Kong, Africa, Chinese national government. So elements of this are spreading around the world through the civic organizations, the internet, organizations like the World Bank. So the World Bank made a lot of loans and paid for lots of reconstruction in Russia about 20 years ago. And what did the Russians do? Well, the Russian president said, I have a dacha and a little country house out there. You think you could fix up my country house while you're doing the construction work here that we're paying for? Just as a small favor, the president says to the construction company, "Oh, sure, well, we'll fix up your house over there." So that means that was just taken as normal ways of doing business. Okay. The way Trump is doing a little bit now. Okay. The point was, the World Bank auditors caught this, and the World Bank made a big scandal and said, "Look at what the president of Russia did. This is corruption. We shouldn't give any more loans to Russia because they're corrupt." So it became a big issue. And so my point is, even if a small minority of people, maybe most people in Russia didn't know or didn't care because it's the way they've done it for centuries. If you get a small set of organizations like the World Bank starting to say, or the European Union, which the European Union is more dominated by the Germans and the Northern Europeans, and they're imposing the Swedish, the Finns. So the Finns are the real outliers. They're the Finns in the North German Calvinist style is being imposed on the Italians and the Spanish. They've got to stop this corruption stuff, etc. And so that and basically that happened in a couple of decades ago within the EU. So, but my point is, these are not just local. These are not just Switzerland. These are bigger issues which inform decisions today in China, in India, in Chicago. Okay, let me stop there and let's talk about any of this, and with examples or questions or whatever. or think of ways of asking some questions if you want when Erwin is here about details of Switzerland, because they're doing these things and they work, and that is, I wouldn't say they work perfectly. I mean, but the Swiss ideals are even stronger than the American ideals, and you can then say, how do these, and the Swiss are very critical. Erwin himself is very critical of the Swiss society, of the Swiss. I mean, he'll say, this isn't working right in Neuchâtel, even though we worked in Lausanne. But so they're very critical, but at the same time they've got empirical examples of how it works if you've got unions and neighborhood groups and others all in the same meeting at once. And there have been a lot of studies of Swiss democracy and voting and efficiency and measures. Okay, questions, comments? In the back there, what's your name? Where are you from?
Cyrus.
From where? Albuquerque. Okay, great. Any thoughts of how this relates either to Albuquerque or things that you're personally familiar with?
I guess, first thing I go actually look at
Just a little bit louder so we can pick it up.
I look from the small town outside of Albuquerque.
All the better. Great.
It's more, I guess it's kind of similar to the Swiss example you said. There's there's a lot of communication in the community. It's mostly elderly citizens, and so there's an issue about some something that most of the top states in it. It's like a black so that's, I guess, similar in the sense to
The Swiss model. Okay, well that's very interesting. Any specifics? Say what? How about campaigns for mayor or city council or public? Where have been divisions?
I mean, most of it, I feel like when looking at their actual platforms for layers, it's not that much. There's not big differences really. It's really project based, I guess. Like they'll be talking about, I really want to just work on the sewage systems. That's not really, I guess, the politics are.
Now that's terrific. I mean, it's terrific to have that as an example, and it's closer to the Swiss model, and it's closer to aspects of what Tocqueville was really talking about New England. He was not talking about the slave system in the South and its legacy with ethnic confrontations and the like. So in that sense, that's a great example. And what's the ethnic background traditionally of people in the town, historically and then more recently?
I mean, it was like for 100 years it was just a Spanish village. I guess before, it was traditionally sort of Hispanic population, and then I guess as it passed out, maybe 10% white, older citizens. So I'd say like it's usually like the Albuquerque itself is very multi-ethnic. Mexico itself is very multi-ethnic, but it's one town's kind of like it's extremely wealthy, and there's no real, I guess, diversity in it. It's not as opposed to like it's historically Mexico has like a pretty complex racial history. Just like how indigenous people have been treated as well. It's just not like the Hispanic population still has themselves, I guess, higher than indigenous people. So it's like ethnically Hispanic, but not like South American Hispanic. It's not like it's well devastating.
Okay, so it sounds like you almost can get you almost can hear the situation of people saying there, we're part of Mexico and Spain, and it's an accident that these gringos took over the federal government. Okay, no, that's a theme that you hear in some of those. All right, that's great. Well, that's an excellent example of that. Is it okay to name the name of your town? Is that not?
Corrales, New Mexico. How it's called Corrales, New Mexico. I mean, just
C-O-R?
C-O-R-R-A-L-E. It's from like corral.
Corrales, Mexico is the name?
New Mexico, yeah.
So Corrales, state of New Mexico. Okay, terrific. Okay, and roughly what's the size of the population?
Under 10,000.
Under 10,000 population. Okay, so I mean that fits the some of these ideals also of having, and you, unlike Chicago, you didn't have a Polish minority, an Italian minority. You had Mexican and then the white Caucasians. And that you have across much of the South and the Southwest, that you don't have these northeast ethnic differences which in Chicago are highly politicized, and with ethnic parades, with 50 aldermen, with different ethnic politics. And so in that sense, it's good to bring out these contrasts. Anybody else want to give us something else that we can link to some of these patterns, or see how they don't seem to work? Does someone have an instinctive feel that there's something wrong with some of these examples and interpretations? What's your name? Where are you from?
I'm Audrey.
Audrey?
I'm from the suburbs of Chicago.
Which one?
Northern suburbs. I'm from Lake Bluff.
Okay, great. Any thoughts on how these things fit with that area?
I think it's interesting, like in terms of like the teachers unions in schools like that. I think it's very different, like the examples you were talking about Switzerland, because like I went to public high school, and like all the decisions there were made based on like only people in the teachers union, only people surrounding there, and I thought it was interesting, like comparing, like growing up with that in comparison to like what goes on in Switzerland, where like everybody kind of meets together. Because like in my town, it was literally just people involved with the school who made the school decisions, and people who were like paying taxes for the school had no say in it. So.
Okay. And certainly high quality schools in that area is a classic strength and a classic driver of migration, of people shifting from different suburbs there, as well as from the west and western suburbs. And that's we talked about Hinsdale and Wheaton and Glen Ellen as three contrasting suburbs, even adjacent to one another.
Yeah, I think too that like a lot of people are moving out there because the school system is primarily like upper middle class, like working families out there. So I feel like with a good school system, it's like that's why a bunch of people are moving up there. It's the last part.
Good. Several PhDs on those suburbs, studied by name by people who lived there their entire lives. Okay. Anything that doesn't quite fit that I said that you think of either today or earlier, as you sound knowledgeable and you sense that you follow local politics a bit.
Yeah, I follow a little bit. Like I have a lot of friends that follow it. I don't think that like in terms of school administration, like back to Switzerland, I don't think it's very admired because a lot of people are mad that they're paying for taxes. That's a lot of reason why that's a reason why older people are moving out, because they're paying taxes for things that they don't benefit from. So I think that it's not very admired in the school, like realm like that, because they're paying for taxes they have no direct benefit from. So that's like an area of controversy.
Okay, but that's a good point to bring out explicitly, because that's a contradiction with the Calvinist ideal of the public good, or in the title of Daniel Elazar's book that I sent out, the commonwealth. That is, in an ideal. I mean, Rousseau talked about this, that we should even not permit very self-interested persons to have any vote. So, in that sense, one might say if all the citizens felt the trust and engagement and a moralistic responsibility to maintain the good schools, they wouldn't move out when their kids left school. So if you move in there for 4 years because you went to high school, and then you move out because you want low taxes, that in a sense you could say is the middle Atlantic individualistic style. rather than the general moralistic style of interviewing.
Yeah, that was very common. A lot of people did that. They moved for their kids, and then when they're done, they move back up.
Yeah, no, but that's interesting. So in that sense, it implies not a simple New England Calvinist Swiss. I won't say, I mean clearly the self-interest everywhere, but the question is how you define your self-interest. And if you define self-interest as including good schools and kids, even if you're not in schools yourself, that transforms the public, at least the rhetoric and the debate. Whereas the tone that you're conveying implies more of an interesting mix of individualism and the collectivism in LSI's terms. And certainly we get that across a lot of the American law. But how about Lake Bluff compared to a couple of the other immediate nearby towns? Are there differences you see in these regards?
Yeah, so Lake Bluff is actually really close to like North Chicago and stuff that you see like a very fine line. Lake Bluff and North Chicago is pretty much like black and white in terms of like, because it's a predominantly African American type town versus like Lake Bluff, like Forest is 99.9% white people. So like there is a very big divide between like crime and the education system. Like it's very different driving 10 minutes. I think that's always interesting. So.
Yeah.
My background is very different. I'm from a small town in southeast Missouri. But kind of one of the points that you touched on with like self-interest in schools and funding, our town doesn't have like a teacher union or anything like that. We're just public elected officials of the school board. They kind of make more of the decisions policy-wise on where the funding's going. But one of the interesting things is along the kind of eastern part of our county is a lot of German heritage from just traveling from Mississippi, and that's kind of where they settled in this area. And they are granted predominantly farmers, and so there's always at the school board, which is only like 8 people, a good majority of them are farmers, and so they have a lot of pushback against any type of funding and taxes that go towards any type of school reform or build up because of the property tax for farms. So there's like this intention of like trying to have progression in like for the schools and development and pushback from the community of the farming community. So that's kind of like, even though it's a smaller town, there's I think 8,000 is our population, there's still like that divide and like cohesiveness also.
Any other insights that you might bring to what we've talked about from the literature and what I've said from thinking of your town?
Yeah, I think like aside kind of from that school situation, they're fairly being so small, and it's 99.9% white and very conservative in a small town. Like they're pretty united on I think most political issues and policy that kind of comes out of it. It's just like that school divide and kind of like trying to invest in the school production versus like taxation of farming. It's like that one kind of big divide. I think everything else is pretty good divide. It's kind of like that again, the silver model, the smaller community being less divided.
When you say conservative, are they equally conservative on all social issues as well, or just the fiscal issues?
Most social issues, they're very, very, very
Why?
I guess a lot of the area is predominantly Catholic. They align kind of on. It's a very, I think, bubble community is how I would describe it. Like there's not much of a worldly approach or kind of any that transcends beyond the county lines. So being so like white Catholic, like their ideals kind of align with a lot of the more conservative ideals.
Someone sitting in front of you is saying, there are lots of kinds of Catholics.
Yes. But it's very much I feel like it's stereotypical small town, like kind of the vibes you get from the theater things like that. Like they're very much religious during Sunday, everyone like big single issues like abortion, like there's everything is pro-life, like the schools will send
comment in a very different kind of context. Anybody who hasn't talked much of you? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, but you have is your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, great. What's your name? Where are you from?
Serene, Singapore.
Singapore. Okay, great. Tell us a little bit of how this matches what you've seen of Singapore.
So Singapore is interesting because it's both a city and a country, and so whereas like Switzerland we're talking about is sort of highly like decentralized, Singapore is almost the opposite, and so and Singapore also has only had one party in control for its entire history of the country, and that that sort of affects the way sort of what people expect from government. There's like the People Action Party, the party controls Singapore, known for wearing all white, which is supposed to signify like anti-corruption or something. So that factors into our discussion of sort of clientelism. Ideally, there's none of that in Singapore. And then as far as schools go, since things are sort of done not through property taxes, resources are sort of allocated more proportionately, I guess you could say. Because I mean, I'm not living in Singapore,
And the key point is local property taxes.
yeah,
So
exactly.
there's an incentive to leave Lake Bluff if the taxes would go up because they would differ from living in Evanston or Northbrook or another town, which might have lower taxes. So if you have the same thing in the whole country, that was Paul Peterson's argument that redistribution must only be funded at the national level to destroy the incentive to move local. So that's what you're describing.
So that basically that's what I was going to compare it to, because I know there are like certain states where they've decided to sort of use like more regional or even like statewide taxes as opposed to like local taxes to sort of get rid of sort of inequalities, sort of thing.
Okay, last comment?
I was
or
wondering,
question?
with the ideological spectrum, is it, because I feel like, at least in Sweden, it's not as much you pick and choose as you were describing that Trump does, and might seem more, the situation in the US. I feel like it's more set out that if there are a bunch of parties and they're, very clearly defined along the spectrum, is that the same in Switzerland? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I mean, Sweden and Switzerland are both good examples of highly educated, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, but also having much stronger parties traditionally than in the U.S. And they did have a stronger left-right visible, either two-party, generally not just two, but 3, 4, 5, 6 parties, which could be classified more clearly. And generally in Sweden, a social democratic domination for a long time, and in Norway, Denmark a little less maybe. But in that sense, I would say one big interesting theme that I talked about, which is an international theme, but illustrated perhaps most strongly in Sweden, was what happened to corporatism. That is, you had national policy where you didn't have conflict between unions and management and the state, because they all agreed that they will give the same amount of pay increase to everybody in at least the corporate linked big, then these were mainly the big corporations, Volvo and so forth. So everybody got a 6% increase, and management would agree that they can. So in that sense, you didn't have this kind of divisive local differences by individual unions. And I pointed out that fell apart as you had more education, more egalitarianism, more women wanting to work part-time, and the explosion of daycare in local government, which created jobs for women at the same time that it undercut the ideal that the patriarchal Volvo worker would support his wife and children. And since you had some women working at Volvo who wanted to work half-time, it made it harder to have a uniform, consistent kind of set of criteria, and so Sweden in that sense Sweden went through it, and the Swedes participating with us did 6 of our surveys of the FAWI project. And if they were so concerned that the welfare state was being abolished in Sweden, and how much was it varying locally, and what were the local dynamics, they kept doing surveys, asking the council members and mayors, the finance directors, what were they doing, and how, and where, and how was it. So we had a lot of conferences of the Swedes talking with other Scandinavians and then other people. This was part of the whole taxpayers' revolt kind of discussion in the U.S. and in other countries. So the big point I would say in general, or let me give one example of another lack of uniformity. There were studies of voters, of younger men in Sweden, who when the Sweden, like the rest of Western Europe and the U.S., basically had a drop by half of blue-collar manual laborers. This destroyed the ability of the communists and socialists and the Democratic Party to say, we represent the working man. Instead, they said, we now embrace women, sustainability, gays and lesbians, animal rights, human rights, the environment, and these are the program of the left. Okay, what happened then to the blue-collar Swedish men? The young men basically said, I'm not going to vote for these people anymore. They became people closer to Trump. That is, you had in Scandinavia and in Germany and in France, you had the emergence of the nationalist, anti-immigrant right parties in Stockholm and Oslo, and there were, again, this was not 50%. This was maybe, because these folks may be 10%, 15% of the whole, but you could have 10, 15, 20% of council members in some city councils and in national governments, whereas the younger women, even less educated, tended to vote Green. So there was an interesting gender division among young people within Sweden, which again broke up the parties. So that fits this story. That the specific issues, including gender here, differentiated the links to the party position. So in that sense, I'm suggesting that the same processes are going on in Sweden as elsewhere, even though we're adding, of course, that the party system played a more visible central role in Sweden and in all of Scandinavia and in Switzerland. Okay, we're at the end of time. I'll hold office hours now for anybody who wants to talk individually, and bring your friends and questions for Aaron Zimmerman on Wednesday.